Good afternoon, comrades, and a very warm welcome. Perhaps I should put my video on. It's a small group. Not sure if you can see me. Hi, everybody. I'm actually at a National Executive Committee with NUMS. I've taken in what I think is a really important meeting on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, the pitfalls, myths, challenges, and what it is that we can be doing, or how we can take the issues forward. So I'm delighted to be participating in this process, and thanks very much to AIDC, who've asked me to host the meeting, noting a lot of the work that I've been doing, that I've done historically on trade. We've got quite an interesting lineup. So we have Jonathan Conrad, who's the co-host for the Zoom, but also from AIDC. We've got Africa Kisler, who's from Siatini, and then we've got Simon Evil, who's from the South African Clothing Textile Workers Union. So, Jonathan, if you can just guide me. So it would be Africa that goes first. And I know, Africa, you've got some challenges in relation to time. So we'll make sure that after we do the presentations and we open up for questions, if I can also, we're seeing attendees coming online. We're going to try and get much of the conversation and questions that are directed to you to go first, so that at least a lot of the discussion and your participation in this particular process can actually be enhanced to the best, noting that there's a time constraint. Okay, so I think we're first going to do Africa, and then we're going to do Simon, and then Jonathan will actually finish. Okay, so again, a very, very warm welcome to all three panelists, and I look forward to, and I'm sure just like the participants, fruitful engagement and discussions around what is quite an important subject matter for all of us, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So over to you, Africa. A very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Comrade Hamida. It's good to see you, and for everyone, it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. You will excuse my background if you hear some background noise. The question of the CFTA, I wish to first of all take it to the quest for African unity, way back to the days of the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group. You will remember that at the onset in 1961, there were two tensions, two groups. We had the Casablanca group, which was looking for the utmost and expedited unification of Africa as one, as a single bloc. And this was looking at the Pan-African context where Africa was united. If you remember the famous Nkrumah's writing of Africa Must Unite Now, that was inspired by the Casablanca group. That for Africa to be integrated, it had to first unite, even politically. But at the same time, we had the Monrovia group. This group believed in a gradual integration of Africa. Yes, it believed in Pan-Africanism, but it believed more in a gradual process where member states would retain their autonomy, and that is national independence, but also sovereignty. So ultimately, the Monrovia group, of course, won the day. And this was what I might call the beginning of differences between African countries on what kind of Africa we wish to have. And that's why you find that we are not surprised that we are having the Agenda 2063 talking about the Africa we want. I mean, today we even don't know what kind of Africa we want. So there was a missed opportunity, because if you wish to recall the words of Julius Nyerere, who was the first president of the Republic of Tanzania, he indicated the regrets why he decided to join the Monrovia group, because there was a missed, according to him, there was a missed opportunity regarding integration of Africa outright when the Monrovia group, which looked at the gradual integration of Africa won over the Casablanca Group. And this is important. This is important regarding the struggles, the current struggles of achieving the African Continental Free Trade Area objectives. Because when you look at the AfCFTA, whose negotiations began in 2012, basically when we were in the when they were in the Johannesburg, and the member states, after seeing the success of the tripartite free trade area, decided to create an Africa-wide replica of the tripartite. The tripartite brings together COMESA, SEDAC, and EAC member states to form one sub-African trading group. So there was an impression that we could replicate that at the Africa level. So when we launched negotiations, 2015, then 2016, and then 2018, we concluded the discussions on a framework of establishing the CFTA. There were already tensions regarding how parties moved. Take an example in 2018. There was already 3 documents when we went to Kigali in 2018 March. 3 documents were presented. The first one was a declaration on the CFTA. The second one was the CFTA negotiating text, what you might call the text. And the third one was in the protocol on movement of persons. Many country states, many African countries signed the declaration. A few signed the CFTA template. Very few, I think like 20%, excluding South Africa, moreover, of course, signed the protocol on movement of persons, free movement of persons, because the CFTA is pegged on movement of persons. You cannot only talk about movement of goods and shared movement of persons. Those are 2 different things that you cannot divorce. But currently, the CFTA is challenged with the fact that at the onset, because you may recall that on 1st January 2021, trade commenced. And you can see I'm putting it in quotes because trade has not really commenced, because actually the legal frameworks, the annexes that would make this trading feasible are yet to be finalized. Let me take an example. You cannot talk about trading when you have not finished identifying which goods you are going to open up and which goods you're going to protect. Countries are still identifying the goods that they are going to open up, liberalize, and the goods that they are going to protect. Countries are still identifying that, and it is just now at 85%. Rules of origin are very critical. Countries are yet to finalize the aspects of rules of origin of the CFTA. So there is the CFTA process has been mired by 2 contradictions. The contradiction on what the politicians and heads of states want or wish to see, and the reality, the technical aspects. For example, whereas the politicians indicated that come January 2021, the CFTA should be finalized and in force, and that trading should commence by then. January reaches, the political deadline is attained, but there is no trading happening because technically that has not been able to materialize. 2.
Hi, Africa.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Could you maybe switch off your video? We seem to be struggling with the networks. I'd like comrades to really hear you. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope this is okay now. The second aspect I wish to put across is the challenge. Am I clear now?
Yes, much better. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. The second aspect I wish to talk about is the question of regional tensions in the building blocks, because the CFTA envisions the existing regional economic communities like SADC, East African Community, ECOWAS, the Arab Maghreb Union, this ECAS. It envisions these to form building blocks for the implementation of the AfCFTA. Unfortunately, the current state of play in these regs is not success, is not maturing, is not favorable for the implementation of the CFTA. Let me take an example of the East African community. Currently, it is going to make 3 years since Uganda and Rwanda ceased trading with each other by crossing of the borders together. Kenya has the issue of non-tariff barriers have always been prevalent and occurring in East Africa. Kenya blocking American poultry and the beef from Uganda. Kenya blocking rice from Tanzania. That is the case. In the ECOWAS, the tensions between Nigeria and Ghana, and Burkina Faso, Togo and Ghana. So there are always these trade tensions and inward looking among partner states at the regional level. And this inward looking goes back to the days of the Monrovia group. Remember, I started by showing that the Monrovia group believed in integration, but through a synchronized manner where countries retain their national interests and national autonomy. So the inward looking that we see to date at the African level, at the rec level, is a replica of what the Monrovia group wanted. When we go to SADC, it is the same thing. Look at the challenges between South Africa and Zimbabwe. Look at the issues in Namibia and Botswana. So there are trade tensions. There is restrictions of movement of persons. There is restrictions on mutual recognition of certificates, that if I am a lawyer from Uganda, when I travel to KwaZulu-Natal, I am able to practice. My certificates will be recognized. That is yet to be harmonized at the Africa level. But also the issue of open skies, that it is still very hard and very expensive to travel from, for example, Uganda to Cameroon than traveling from Uganda to UK. So we still have challenges of movement of persons, but also infrastructure, which is still working against the successful implementation of the CFTA. With infrastructure, take an example of the small economies like Seychelles and Mauritius. These are largely fishery economies, but 95% of all the fishing boats in Africa are foreign owned. We do not have our own vessels, our own ships to not only fish but also undertake trading. So it doesn't make sense, for example, for a Ugandan or a Kenyan farmer to sell their produce to Nigeria because infrastructure does not allow. So we are looking at rhetoric, the rhetoric of having in place an African continental free trade area that allows movement of persons and goods, but also reality. Reality being that we are still faced with structural challenges of non-tariff barriers, of restrictions, of trade tensions, of limited movement of persons and workers, that constrain Africa's capacity to be able to open up trading under the AfCFTA. I ask for 2 more minutes, Chair, to be able to underscore.
Yes, please go ahead, Africa. You're still within time.
Aspects. One of the aspects on services liberalization. This is where I think the audience should be interested. The African Continental Free Trade Area is very broad in its liberalization. It is liberalizing goods, but also services. And in goods, it is liberalizing under 3 phases. It is liberalizing 90% outright. 90% of the tariff lines will be liberalized there and then. Then it will liberalize 7% in a phased manner. And then only 3%, countries are left with only 3% to say we are not opening up on these products. That is in the goods. But look at services. And allow me to share this slide for purposes of explaining that. You look at services. I hope you can see this. If you look at services, they are going to liberalize a total of 7 services. But these services have different aspects. Look at the business services, professional services like legal, accounting, architecture, engineering, urban planning, medical, all that. Look at consideration services, research, real estate, other businesses like advertising, market research. Look at communication services. All communication aspects are to be liberalized: postal, courier, telecommunication, construction, distribution, education, name it. So what I am trying to underscore here is that the African Continental Free Trade Area is taking on the same mode of other agreements which we have shunned. Agreements like the Economic Partnership Agreement, because it is looking at a flawed logic that increased liberalization will lead to increased trade outright, and that will also lead to increased incomes. But we have known that unless you address the production challenges, unless you address the supply challenges, unless you undertake a transformative approach in trading, then the AfCFTA is again going to bring in place more inequalities, more poverty, but also in terms of trade diversion, where, for example, countries like South Africa, even at SADC level and at the tripartite level, have already swamped economies of poor partners like Uganda, like Rwanda, like Tanzania. So unless we undertake a transformative approach of the CFTA, then we are going to create the big brother syndrome, which is going to reinforce the challenges that Africa is still grappling with as a result of liberalization and as a result of opening up. Thank you so much. I think I should stop here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Comrade Africa. And I think, you know, what a formidable task you've had, both in terms of presenting us with a bit of a background. And in fact, I must be honest, I didn't realize that it was the Monrovia versus the Casablanca group. I mean, I think when we talk about regional integration, it's something that went, you know, way back. I mean, with Third World Network, I think it was even before 2007. So it's quite interesting, and thanks so much. I think the participants as well would have really appreciated the insights in terms of the background. I think you really also highlight, you know, aspiration versus reality. So there's an aspiration towards, you know, Pan-Africanism, one continent, a sense of unity. But at the same time, as the aspirations and policies and agreements being negotiated at a very top-up level, or at a high level, there seems to be a disconnect already in terms of the examples that you're raising at a domestic level when it comes to interregional trade, intercountry trade, and then also the historical context, where despite the fact that we're talking about Africa, we know that within the continent itself, different countries, I mean, we are not all equal, and that, as you rightly pointed out, the potential for South Africa to be the big brother on the continent, particularly within SADC and the role that we're currently playing, as well as our role at the AU, could actually undermine the very essence of what we were trying to achieve in terms of our own regional integration. So thank you very, very much for those insightful contributions. I now hand over to Comrade Jonathan, and he's from the AIDC. Jonathan, over to you. Thanks very much.
Afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Africa and Hamida, for those inputs. It's very useful, and I also learned quite a lot through that presentation. So I'll be stepping back a little bit, and I'll be sort of placing the AfCFTA in the broader context of free trade around the world, and speaking to some of the issues that we see in free trade more broadly, and specifically in the AfCFTA. So first, I want to speak a little bit about what free trade actually is. I think we haven't really spoken about that yet. Broadly speaking, free trade is really just the removal or reduction of any barriers to trade. And the aim is to increase levels of international trade. And the main barrier that's removed here, the main thing we're talking about in the AfCFTA is the removal of import tariffs. These are taxes on imported goods or services, usually as a percentage of the value of the import. So when we're speaking about removal of trade barriers, we're mainly talking about the removal of import tariffs, but we're also talking about technical barriers to trade, and we're talking about subsidies, intellectual property rights, etc. So free trade assumes that the removal of these barriers will allow states to exploit what's called their comparative advantages. And their comparative advantages are the industries, the products that they're most sort of naturally able to produce without state intervention and without prioritizing industries, the most sort of market-led natural endowments, essentially. So on the African continent, what this means and what we've seen increasing in the past 30 years or so is raw materials exports. South Africa has lots of raw materials. Its main comparative advantage is in procuring these materials and exporting them abroad. So what free trade does, despite its name, is that it actually limits the policy options available to states. It locks them into this market-driven paradigm in which they're required to just exploit their comparative advantages. It prevents them from targeting the industries or the products that they find desirable or strategic. So by locking them into exploiting their comparative advantages of raw materials exports, for example, it prevents strategic sort of protection and favoring of other industries, for example, renewable energy, technology, manufacturing, etc. Historically, states have always used some level of protection and some level of strategic industrial policy around their key industries. So we've seen in the past that states that have successfully industrialized have picked industries, put some level of tariff barriers around them, and use subsidies and localization to build these industries before opening them up to the global markets. And this is no longer really available because of trade liberalization, but I'll get into that a bit more. So free trade agreements are just any agreement that is between states that agrees to lower tariff or other barriers between any of these member states. The first important one, or the largest one, is the World Trade Organization, which came into effect in 1995. And almost all countries in the world are members to this, including most African states. And then since then, there have been a whole host of bilateral agreements, those are between two states, or multilateral state blocks form agreements between each other. So most African countries are not just part of the AfCFTA, they're part of this whole host of, it's often called a spaghetti bowl of overlapping and intertwining free trade agreements. South Africa, for example, is 17 or 18 or so free trade agreements signed on to. It's also important to remember here that these agreements don't just regulate tariff barriers, they don't just regulate the sort of external relations of states. There's also quite a bit of regulation of internal industrial policy. So investment policy is regulated, intellectual property rights, government procurement, subsidies, etc., are all subject to trade agreements. So this brings me into the AfCFTA specifically. It is between 54 of the 55 AU member states. So it's important to remember here that almost all African countries are members of the AfCFTA. Again, this technically came into force in January of this year, but as Africa told us, it hasn't really been used very much. Trade hasn't increased within the continent yet. And again, as Africa said, it removes or reduces tariffs on 90% of goods. only 3% can be protected indefinitely. The overall aim here is to increase trade within the continent. Africa has the lowest levels of intracontinental trade. And furthermore, what's important is that trade within the continent is generally in slightly higher value added goods. So Africa tends to export to the rest of the world raw materials, 75 to 80% raw materials, but within the continent, it's a much higher percentage of at least lightly manufactured, slightly industrial goods. So the argument goes that by increasing trade within the continent, you can build value chains and slightly industrialize and build up these slight manufacturing and industrial goods productions. And also the aim here is that it would eventually diversify economic activity on the continent, and producing these value chains would make the continent more self-sufficient and less reliant on the rest of the world. So what are some of the problems that we foresee with this trade liberalization? The first I want to speak to is what's called the race to the bottom. And this is what we've seen in most free trade agreements or the broader trade liberalizations since the early 1990s. Essentially, as free trade has spread around the world, international trade has greatly increased. This has been coupled with much more mobility for capital. This means that manufacturing and other industrial processes can really happen anywhere in the world. They're no longer bound within nation states. So companies will now move their industries wherever it is essentially cheapest to do so. What this has meant is that states are competing against each other to attract foreign direct investment. And they compete in doing this by lowering labor costs, which means lowering minimum wages and labor protections. They lower environmental regulations, deregulate the financial sector, lower corporate tax rates, and things like this in order to make the most favorable environment for foreign direct investment. Not only is this clearly incredibly detrimental to the working class and the environment, poverty reduction, development, etc., it also often doesn't work. What we've seen in South Africa in the past 30 years since signing the WTO and a whole host of other free trade agreements is the state has adopted many of these policies. It's competing with other states around the globe to attract investment, especially to bring manufacturing here. But we've seen exactly the opposite. Manufacturing is increasingly moved abroad, and the share of GDP that is manufacturing has decreased, and this is reflected in the steadily increasing unemployment rate. Probably all saw the unemployment stats just yesterday. This is largely a reflection of manufacturing moving abroad, despite the fact that the state is in this race to the bottom. So what we're likely to see with the AfCFTA is just a continuation of this process of the state competing to attract investments, but even now more so against other African states. Furthermore, another issue, and Africa touched on this, is that only a few African states really have the capacity to take advantage of these potential new value chains that could be created. So what we're likely to see is that states like South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt are going to sort of become almost sub-imperial powers on the continent. They're not particularly industrialized, but they do have slightly more entrenched industrial capacity. They're likely to flood the industries of other smaller countries with weaker, smaller industries. And these smaller states no longer have the ability to really put any tariffs around their industries. They're allowed to pick about 3% to keep some tariffs on, but that's really all. So they've lost this capacity to protect their local industries from, say, South African or Nigerian exports. There's also a worry that beyond just these few African states that might take advantage, the true beneficiaries might be entrenched non-African countries that have manufacturing capacity. There are rules of origin that regulate whether or not a product originates within the bloc. And if a product does not originate within the bloc, it cannot be traded under these preferential tariff rates. However, there's a concern that the African states that have bilateral agreements with other countries will become sort of entry points through which goods can enter the now essentially single market within the continent, and it can be shipped in through there and then spread around the African continent, allowing other entrenched manufacturing countries to really be the true beneficiaries of the AfCFTA. A way to get around this would be subsidies. And subsidies essentially lower the cost of production. So states could put subsidies on their important industries, and they could couple this with local content requirements. What this would do is it would incentivize companies or manufacturers to get inputs lower down the value chain from within the continent. It would be cheaper to do this than it could have sort of build up these value chains. Unfortunately, the issue is that this agreement means that any subsidies that are contingent on domestic content requirements or export performance are banned. So localization is almost entirely banned in the agreement. Any subsidies that the state provides would have to be given to foreign industries as well. So local content requirements are almost entirely impossible. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that essentially trade liberalization by itself is not going to lead to development. It's likely to only increase inequality within the continent, allow these sort of subimperial powers on the continent to potentially take over and sort of wipe out the industries of the smaller states. And what would perhaps allow this agreement to have some success is if it could be coupled with allowance for certain industrial policies, such as localization, subsidization, etc., and obviously some level of tariff protection as well. But by taking away these core development tools and industrialization tools of the state, the tools that have historically been used for industrialization, and simply having trade liberalization, it's likely to increase the race to the bottom, deindustrialize the continent, worsen inequality, and very likely continue the race to the bottom. So I'll end there. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. I must say, you know, when I recently made an input to COSATU, and I mean, at the end of the input, or it was actually commenting to a presentation that was made by various comrades on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And at the end of the meeting, when I was doing reflections on my own input, I was wondering whether I was being overly negative. But I'm glad. Well, I'm glad in the sense that a lot of the concerns that I've raised, you're definitely echoing. And I think a lot of us who've been working in the trade space know the danger when you do liberalization without degrees of protectionism. But more importantly, when we're doing it with a continent of leaders and departments where the capacitation, I mean, the WTO has given trade modalities and has even, in fact, had special meetings within Africa, you know, asking African countries and civil society organizations to support the WTO to run training for African countries, particularly in the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So I think you know, you've really highlighted some of the key challenges and the potential. I mean, you know, with anything, there's obviously opportunities, and it does hold the potential, in essence, for something different to happen. But if we're going to be following the same neoliberal orientation towards liberalization without facilitating a process for protectionism and for countries to actually determine the level at which they're going to open up, we can see devastation. And I think there's nobody better than to speak to this than Simon Eppel. He's in the clothing and textile industry. And we know, especially as South Africans, I think to some extent, even within SADC, the way in which liberalization without protectionism and without actually allowing an industries to develop or to adjust to foreign imports and the impact that has had on the clothing, footwear, and textile industries. So I'll hand over to, with that brief introduction, but also I think in some ways also provoking you, Comrade Simon, please take the floor, and I look forward to your presentation. Thanks.
Hi, comrades, welcome, or thanks for welcoming me. Comrade Hamida, I'm delighted that you're the chair. And let me say transparently to everyone, Comrade Hamida's previous comments to COSATU were partly made to me, and actually I agree with them. I'll take you through the presentation shortly. If you give me an opportunity, I'm going to turn off my camera and turn on my my presentation for you. And if you can just please let me know if it comes up. Is anything showing?
Yes, it is showing.
Cool. Okay, awesome. So my name is Simon Eppel. I work in one of the COSATU trade unions. I don't want to pretend that this presentation is on behalf of all trade unions, but I would like to share with you some thoughts from our side. You know, much wisdom I think has been shared by both Africa and Jonathan, but also from Hamida's side. So there's some overlap, and I apologize for that. But I think maybe in hindsight, it's complementary. So, I mean, firstly, let me just give you a bit of a sense of how this all fits together in terms of my trade union and the industry in which our members are. And those, our members are in the clothing, textile, footwear, and leather manufacturing industry. So, you know, our members are largely workers in factories, you know, making various items of clothing, the fabrics that used to make clothing, but also the fabrics used to make a host of other kinds of things, you know, curtains, carpets, hospital products, industrial fabrics, you know, really a wide range of things, and then a wide range of footwear and leather products also. But they're situated in an interesting niche because they are on what we sometimes refer to as like the litmus test of globalization. It's like right on the edge of the most iniquitous part of global trade, which, you know, clothing is often that. It's highly competitive, based in a global trade regime of deep inequalities, deep unfairness, partly, as Jonathan says, on the race to the bottom type forms of competition, partly on the basis of who's got the most money to sponsor the largest subsidies, and partly on the kind of fluctuations of currency exchanges and a range of other factors. And what happens is it means that workers in the garment, textile, footwear, and leather sectors around the world are highly at risk from the challenges with global trade. And I'll come to that in a moment. For us, we've seen that, as Comrade Hamida said, you know, very distinctly. And from 1996 onwards, when South Africa joined the World Trade Organization, and we started a process of not just fast tracking down our tariffs, but taking them further down than we actually were required to by WTO law or rules, let me say. You know, we've lost easily in excess of 160,000 jobs in our factories. And I was counting through our database of retrenchments the other day. You know, we've got like about almost 2,500 instances of retrenchment, liquidation, and closure. But in other words, you know, it's been a process in which workers have lost their jobs. 2,500 instances. It's massive. And really some of that, or largely, that's related to the inequities of global trade, and I'll come to that. But much that we've suffered at the hands of global trade, and we've seen massive deindustrialization in our industry. The same thing is true in other African countries. And so, you know, you had a process from the 70s onwards of many African countries losing their capacity and having their industries decimated. Although in many other African countries, part of the challenge is compounded by the phenomenon of secondhand clothing, you know, against which manufactured goods can't compete against the product that you can import for 80 cents. I looked at the other day. So, but on the African continent, there's a lot of manufacturing that still takes place. And so what I've done is just sort of flag some of the countries where there's some capacity. You know, and while we have about 75,000 workers in our formal industry, you know, countries like Egypt have 400,000, countries like Nigeria, roughly 25,000. There's countries producing, largely, or many for domestic markets of sorts, a number for export markets into the EU, etc. And a large number of African countries see the clothing, textile, footwear, and leather sector as a competitive space for them. It's a space in which countries want to industrialize, they want to build employment. They see it as a stepping stone into a broader range of industrial competencies, specializations, value chains, jobs, etc. And so, I looked through some statistics the other day of shipments of machinery to the continent, and I could identify 35 out of total African countries, which just in a selection of 5 years have been investing in textile capacity. Now, that's not over the full 10-year period. Just out of a snapshot of a couple of years, there's investment by at least 33 countries. And so we're expecting the trade in clothing, textile, footwear, and leather goods to be a really big objective of member states in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Just a bit of context. So our trade union participates as part of the COSATU delegation in NEDLAC, where policy formation happens, but also there's a chamber which deals with trade and industry matters. We've been engaging on the AfCFTA, or the CFTA as it was at the time, then amended to the AfCFTA, since the mid-2010s, when the issue started being negotiated between member states. It comes to a chamber at NEDLAC, and there we reflect on what's happening and provide mandates or guidance to the state. And we've been critical of the process for a number of reasons. I mean, largely we've argued for the need that South Africa and the AfCFTA needs a developmental trade policy. So much for the reasons that Jonathan has eloquently outlined, that Africa has outlined. Trade for trade's sake is not the objective, and in fact is highly detrimental. The question is, how do you use trade as an instrument of building industries and jobs? And so, it's an argument that we've made that trade policy is not a standalone thing. It's a tool of industrial development and employment creation. And we've wanted the AfCFTA to have protections for workers. It can't be just rampant trade to the detriment of workers. It should allow countries to retain some element of policy space, and it needs to be balanced, not a sort of a winner-takes-all approach. So we've engaged at the level of NEDLAC, but we've also taken our engagements as my trade union to the AU level, where we've negotiated or been part of workshops with other African countries on clothing, textiles, footwear, and leather trade rules for the AfCFTA on the continent. And we've also dealt with other unions on the continent, for example, the Nigerian brothers and sisters. So let me just reflect off some concerns, and both of these have been picked up by both Jonathan and by Africa. But what will be free in the AfCFTA? Well, it's a cascade of things. The largest number of products in the tariff book. The tariff book is literally a detailed classification of every type of product that gets traded. There's about almost 8,000 products in the tariff book. They're slightly different for different countries. But 97% of those products must at some stage, at the end of a period, be moved to 0% duty. 90% of those must be liberalized to 0% duty over 5 years. 7% of the products liberalized over 10 years. And that's a phase down period. The longer your phase down period, ostensibly to some extent, the more protection you get, although eventually you're in the hot seat of free trade. And then a very small number of products, 3% of products, can be excluded from free trade. I've just got a little note slightly above that with clothing, textile, footwear, and leather products, it's almost 1,200 lines. It's a slightly expanded definition. That's far more than 3% of products. So you can see the difficulty that countries have. You're in a position where you're literally sacrificing jobs and factories in an agreement that's arranged like this. So, the other comrades have illustrated the fact that, there can be benefits to trade. Absolutely. You do build industries and jobs off the back of trade, particularly in sectors which are competitive. In South Africa alone, we support 2.6 million jobs from exports and, 250,000 jobs from exports into the continent. And the other comrades have identified some of the arguments for the AfCFTA around beneficiation, developing African value chains, etc. But of course, that's not the full story, and Jonathan's done a great job of highlighting that. That liberalization really exposes workers to the nastiest parts of global trade. the cheapest of imports, and those are products built on the back of saving cost as much as possible, often to the human cost and human rights cost of workers. Of course, there's the element that they destroy local jobs and vulnerable sectors, and I've identified some of that for you in terms of the clothing and textile industry in South Africa, what that looks like. There's no necessary link from free trade to industrialization. It's not a one-to-one relationship that one creates the other. So for example, and both Africa and Jonathan have mentioned this, if you have rules of origin that favor imports or lack of industrialization, you're not going to get the industrialization. Obviously, free trade can also be a vehicle for neo-colonial forms of trade, neo-imperial forms of trade. Both the comrades have spoken to that. And some of the protection mechanisms, if they're not there, like the ability to exclude products from trade or customs controls or others, and I'll come to more later, those can be open to abuse, but if they're weak, you have significant cost. The notion of the race to the bottom has been spoken about, so I won't go into it, except to say, if you just look at the clothing and textile industry in Africa, a country like Ethiopia is a hotshot on the global stage for apparel manufacturing the last number of years. And it's seeing a large amount of investment happening from European companies going there, setting up, Chinese companies, Turkish companies are setting up operations. H&M, for example, does a lot of sourcing in Ethiopia. I've put here, there's no minimum wage in Ethiopia. That's based on an admission from an official, an Ethiopian official. But I mean, classically, it's somewhere around $20 odd a month is the wage in Ethiopia. I mean, it's outrageously low. Then you have other countries which may have minimum wages, but they remain absurdly low. The likes of Madagascar, which could, depending on the source, be somewhere in the $40s or $50 a month. And then you get, other countries on the continent where you get wage suppression. In other words, the realization that wages should be higher, but in order to, quote unquote, boost competitiveness, keeping the wage lower through sort of statutory mechanisms. The problems with the leakage onto the continent, products made elsewhere in the world, leaking into the continent have been flagged. It's, that has to do with weak customs fraud, weak customs control and customs fraud. So it's, essentially, as Jonathan's outlined, products made in a different part of the world being brought onto the continent and then paraded on the continent as though it was made here and traded as originating on the continent. And it is going to be a massive problem. It's not that it's a theoretical problem. It's already a problem. Even, with the smaller regional economic communities that we have, it's rampant. So it will be a problem. And it's a problem that we've been shouting about for a long time in our engagements at NEDLAC. I'll speak to it a bit later. And there are weak protections in the AfCFTA. So I'm going to go to some of these. On the exclusions, you'll remember that you can only exclude 3% of the product. So initially, when we had started the engagements around the AfCFTA, we were pushing for 15% exclusion. And 15% would have allowed us to put in far more of our vulnerable sectors, things like clothing, textiles, footwear, and leather, sugar products, some animal products, poultry, and some others, a bunch of chemicals, which are more vulnerable, some parts of the automotive production sector, etc. So we would have been able to put more of them in. We pushed hard for the 15%, but and the South African government, I know, actually also pushed hard for it in the negotiations. But because of the ideology of free trade, and the number of countries negotiating, the number kept going lower and lower and lower until eventually it was 3% you can exclude. Now that's obviously deeply insufficient. On the rules of origin, it's been explained previously, but I mean, essentially, a strong rule of origin allows you to trade a good on the continent, if you've produced more of it on the continent. In other words, take a clothing product, for example. You've made the fabric on the continent and you've made the clothing garment on the continent. So those are strong encouraging forms of rules of origin. The problem is that sentiment isn't shared across the continent. So, some other member states of the AfCFTA, take, for example, Kenya, the regional economic community, they belong to the EAC. They've adopted a position where, actually they're keen to have, to import products like fabrics from off-continent, from China, from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, etc., and then just act like a screwdriver industry on the continent and just manufacture the garment, the finished product. And it's not a process that creates value chains. They've been joined in this recently by Egypt is supporting them. A number of other countries are supporting them. So bad rules of origin will mean we get poor industrialization. It's something that we fight into. And then the phase down periods, I showed you earlier, the current rules say you must phase down to zero over either 5 or 10 years. We're pushing to make those longer. Essentially, the longer they are, there's some space in the agreement for countries to phase down over a longer period, particularly for more vulnerable countries. So we are trying to push that we adopt a longer phase down. As I said earlier, you eventually end up in a hot seat, but at least you can buy yourself some more time. And some of the other weak mechanisms, for example, is the dispute resolution mechanisms. When problems occur, and they always occur in trade, they're very seldom solved to the benefit of workers. So while there's a dispute mechanism in the AfCFTA, we're not very excited about it. Just briefly, there are another sort of couple of myths we wanted to flag. The one is that the AfCFTA is going to lead to a massive market for the continent of 1.3 billion people. But really, the reality is there's very, very low purchasing power of consumers on the continent. And depending on how you measure it, there's possibly a pool of 350 million to 36 million people with the kinds of purchasing power to really drive some level of backwards integration into manufacturing. And even that's based on a really low number. It's like something like $8 a day worth of spending. And there are very few countries with large middle-class populations that can drive big spending. So this myth of the AfCFTA driving large-scale development, I think we need to dial it back significantly because we don't actually have the consumer power on the continent. The other one, obviously, is that countries think that they're suddenly going to be faced with a lot of opportunities, but you can't easily sell into an unknown entity on the other side. You tend to be able to sell to an entity you can identify in another country. And the problem on the continent is that about 90% of retailing happens in the informal sector. So if you're not easily going to be able to, as a producer, as a country, identify a vendor in a souk in North Africa or an informal market in West Africa, to be able to receive your products. And the nature of retailing on the continent and essentially of channels to market is going to act as a significant impediment. And again, I think requires that we dial back the expectations of the amount of trade that may happen, which doesn't mean the other problems aren't significant, the kinds like fraud, but certainly some of the channels to market, I think, will be very difficult. So just briefly then, what next? Well, based on all the challenges that exist, what kind of things might be needed? Obviously, the agreement has been made at this point, but that doesn't mean that we can't continue to push for changes to it, to amendments to it, etc. So we're still pushing for better carve-outs for vulnerable products and sectors beyond the 3%, or the ability to be able to take protections if necessary. We've been pushing hard for a counterpart program at the level of the continent to really focus on African industrialization so that we don't leave it to trade to industrialize. We have an active concept and program for industrialization. We're pushing for a review mechanism of the AfCFTA on the basis of the amount of industrialization that takes place, and to use that then, if we can get it, to make amendments to the agreement if necessary. We're pushing for high value adding rules of origin to deepen the beneficiation and value chains on the continent. In other words, we want more products to be made by more people on the continent rather than relying on off-continent imports. And we want measures and mechanisms to ensure that growth and trade are more balanced, that we don't have this winner takes all or kind of neo-imperial tendency. We're pushing for a social clause. So that would be some mechanism to be imported into the AfCFTA or amended or appended to the AfCFTA, which basically indicates that if there are abuses of workers that take place of certain kinds, it would have to be against banal forms of benchmarks, but maybe ILO benchmarks, etc. But if there are forms of abuse that are happening in countries, if workers are denied basic rights, then countries and companies are suspended from the agreement and can't trade. We're pushing that both South Africa, but also across the continent, There's a deep drive to build customs capacity so that we don't get that leakage to fraud. We've been pushing for almost like a monitoring unit that could exist on the continent to go and inspect products traded at irregular times to see whether they conform to rules of origin, that fraud's not taking place. And the same kind of thing is actually done in AGOA sometimes. There's inspection units that go out to try to make sure that there's not fraud occurring. And we're looking for suspensive mechanisms. If fraud is occurring, what can be done to suspend companies or countries where fraud is occurring? All of those kinds of actions will need to take the union movement to mobilize in South Africa from our side, etc. But there are additional things that we think we've sort of pushing to happen. We believe there needs to be a much stronger drive of unions to drive industrialization policies in their countries, and certainly domestically. But we think on the continent too. And we think there's a need on the for active monitoring of the AfCFTA and trade and its impacts in terms of industrialization, deindustrialization, jobs, linked to the ability to mobilize if there are concerns. We think there's a gap that exists there. Obviously, we expect unions will mobilize, but we do think there's a need to have an institutionalized structure or at least competencies that exist. We see a need to develop across common positions across the continent on the AfCFTA, on rules of origin, on mechanisms, suspensive mechanisms, on the need for industrialization, and to be advocating for that both nationally and at the AU levels. Some of that happens already, but we actually think there's a lot more that can be done. We just witnessed, for example, across the clothing and textile industries across the continent, some unions are just not involved in the engagements, and the engagements are not only hijacked by business, but sometimes very limited sections of business. And then the last one is, we think there's a need to develop a transnational union support program where we actively build unions on the continent, and we help workers and unions defend and advance their interests. And sometimes their interests may be against ours. And the reality is that they may say South Africa is exporting too much, I don't know, soy sauce. I mean, it's a silly example. Some of those conflicts will exist because that's the nature and contested nature of trade. But I think we need to be in a position where we can build the ability of workers and unions on the continent to raise the flags when the flags exist and need to be raised to indicate that problems with trade are occurring. So, Comrade Hamida, Chair, I am going to withdraw my. I'm trying to now kill the presentation, and I think I'm making a mess up of it.
Yeah, thanks very much. I was trying to figure out how do I actually show you. I should have actually said to you, I'll show you a thumbs up when I mean that you need to wrap up. But thanks very much, Comrade Simon. I think that's quite a comprehensive insight, both in terms of the clothing, footwear, textile, and leather industries, but also, taking us back into what happens when liberalization or trade liberalization takes place, and we're not prepared for it. But also, more importantly, if this is a sector that's already struggling and is vulnerable, there aren't safeguarding mechanisms, and we do not do the necessary to ensure some degree of protectionism, then the devastation that we saw under the gap is something that's going to repeat itself. I think it's also positive that you do also look at the potential for where we can take this in a more positive way. And I think of the one example where it was, I think, Ethiopia and India. I could be wrong. It could be Brazil, but there was an issue where the tanning industry, particularly in the countries of leather, was something that Ethiopia was struggling with, and through a partnership between either India or Brazil, they were able to resuscitate the tanning industry in Ethiopia. Similarly, I think with South Africa vis-a-vis China, we're able to now produce a shoe which is sold at Mr. Price, which is actually comparative both in terms of the nature of the shoe, in terms of what the shoe looks like, the synthetics that are used, as well as the price. And this came through a partnership between India and, China and South Africa. And you obviously would know way more about that than me. But I mean, there are potential examples when we collaborate and share expertise, but also have a common interest of building rather than exploiting. each other and as countries or on the continent. I think those positive examples would definitely be something that we need to look at. So I think, comrades, we've heard we've heard a combination of positives, negatives, kind of challenges that we're facing, and also what is it that we need to do and how it is that we can do it. I think if you look at the chat, Comrade, I know that Comrade Africa has a bit of a challenge. So Comrade Africa, I'm not sure when you looked at some of the questions, whether there was something that you want to maybe respond to. I saw one, for example, in relation to what is actually forcing African countries to actually sign on to the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, if it is that the agreement is very similar to the ones that have been signed under bilaterals with the EU or the WTO. Perhaps that's a question you'd like to answer. Comrade Simon, I know it might have been a question that was directed to me, but I'm quite happy for you to respond to it. It was a question in relation to protectionism. So one of the participants raised the question of, are we actually able to do protectionism? Has there been protectionism in relation to sectors, and has it not always been a case where the horse has not already bolted with cheap imports entering Africa? So I think the question of, can we, under the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, still be negotiating for protectionism? And I think while you've kind of raised the point when you made reference to the fact that there was 15%, when you were negotiating the 15%, that was in relation to protectionism and how that was withered down to 3%. But I think perhaps just to enlighten or engage participants to recognize that you need a combination of both protectionism and liberalization if it is that you're going to develop. And in fact, many countries in the developed world actually used protectionism to a large extent, and when they were ready, liberalization in terms of comparative advantage and markets in order to be where they are today. So with that, I'll open to Comrade Africa, and then maybe Jonathan and Simon, you're most welcome to choose questions on the chat, and then also to participants, if you have specific questions or comments that you'd like to make, you can just indicate with a show of a hand icon, and I'll facilitate the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Hamida. Yes, I wish to speak to two important questions and observations raised by Maduna Carvin and by Benny. Maduna talks about the issue of our unpreparedness as Africa regarding a poor industrial policy, inadequate industrial policy and poor implementation. And they're asking why. Indeed, this is what is confronting the African Continental Free Trade Area. At the beginning, we as civil society, Comrade Hamida, you remember, we've been advocating for a transformative AfCFTA. Now, I wish to undertake the fact to underscore the argument that we are not opposed to the African Continental Free Trade Area. Its intentions are good, because we need indeed to trade more with each other. Like Simon was saying, we need to trade more with each other than we are trading more with the rest of the world. We need to be more integrated in order to fight, in order to have common interests, and in order to become a competitive bloc in the world. But the unfortunate bit is that the African Continental Free Trade Area is being designed in a way that the modalities are not going to contribute to the realization of its aspirations. So whereas the aspirations of the AfCFTA are very valid, the way the rules are being crafted are actually going to compromise these aspirations. And you talked, for example, about industrial policy being lacking. Indeed, you cannot talk about industrialization and value addition, and then you talk about 97% of liberalization for a period of 10, 15 years. That already is compromising, because like the previous speakers were saying, you need industrialization does not happen by mistake. It happens through dedicated and phased interventions by the state. by the private sector. But you cannot achieve this when you are outrightly liberalizing. So the liberalization agenda that is informing the African Continental Free Trade Area, the tariff schedules that we have designed are going to work in a way that they are going to compromise the required industrialization agenda. So that's why we talk about a transformative CFTA. And by the way, we do not need the CFTA first before we can work around addressing production and productivity challenges facing our farmers, our fisher folk, our MSMEs, and our entrepreneurs. This is very critical. Then again, it talks about again, it relates to the question that Benny asked about why are we, what are the factors and the interests that are driving the AfCFTA? Then again, like you remember at the beginning, there were factions at the beginning in 1960. The new independent, well, independent is in the quotes, but let's say the new flag independent Africa by then was fighting on how do we integrate, how do we become more interlinked, how do we address the forces that come from the former colonial masters. So the quest for African unity in all terms has always shrouded the interests of Africa, and that is what is driving Africa, to ensure that Africa is united, to ensure that we increase mobility of persons and workers across Africa, to ensure that we promote the industrialization agenda in Africa, to ensure that we promote infrastructure in Africa. But unfortunately, so these are the drivers, these are the reasons as to why Africa is seeking for integration in the AfCFTA. But unfortunately, the way we are designing rules to drive this agenda and ambition are rather compromising, and they are rather just going to reinforce the existing challenges, both capacity, production, and systemic challenges that Africa has been facing in being a competitive power, but also in premature industrialization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Africa, and I hope you're going to be able to stay with us for a little bit longer. I think very insightful, and I think you've picked up on a couple of really important issues. Obviously, the challenges we don't have enough time, but I think from what you're raising, and I think a lot of the presentations thus far, indicating quite strongly that 1.5 hours for a discussion on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to the AIDC is definitely not enough. I think there's a whole lot more engagement and interrogation that has to go with it. But having said that, let me offer Comrade Jeff, if Comrade Simon and Jonathan don't mind, allow me to offer Comrade Jeff the opportunity to make his input, and then both of you can guide whether you're either responding to his question or statement, or whether you'd like to respond something specifically in the chat. Comrade Jeff, over to you.
Thank you. Am I being heard?
Loud and clear.
Aha. Well, thanks to all of you, and lovely to see you again, Simon, and to meet Africa. Let me start with Africa, because I think you really touched on the heart of it. On the one hand, you say we need it, we need a trade agreement, but you then go on to say all the reasons why this present one is the last thing that we actually do need. Then, of course, it depends on what we mean by we. Trade is always reflective of power. There is no such thing as free trade. And I think it really is essential for us just to see the term free trade is a warning that this is WTO speak. This is power speak. This is not in the interests of people, and certainly not in the interests of workers. But I can't do more than that. You say we need a much more time. We do need a much more substantial critique of the whole, of just trade. We need to understand what trade is and how it fits into the architecture of an unequal world. And trade certainly reflects that inequality. But I do have two questions, and that is, Simon, you kept on speaking about we, and I'd like to know who the we actually are. At one level, I take it that we is NEDLAC, but then who at NEDLAC other than yourself? Is there any union support? Or what is the degree of union support even at NEDLAC? And then to go beyond NEDLAC, at a continental level, African level, how much inter-trade union negotiations contact has there been? Is there a continental trade union we? So those are my questions and comments. And thank you, Hamida.
Thanks, Comrade Jeff. I think I'll, Comrade Simon, that was quite an introduction to your response. Please, if you could, I think there were two questions directed specifically to you, but also if there's something in the chat or any additional comment that you'd like to make, please feel free to do so.
Okay, cool. Jeff, it's lovely to see your name and hear your voice also. So Jeff has got two fantabulous questions, which are stereotypically really astute, because Jeff would ask questions like this. So I must say I was speaking and not thinking about the we that I was referring to. So I'm going to have to retrospectively figure out which we fitted where. But I'm assuming I would mean we in several ways. I mean, the one would be the extent to I was referring to SACTU, and that we would be based on the positions that we develop in SACTU and the debates that we have internally. I've actually just left our National Executive Committee meeting just a few minutes before coming here and did a report on the AfCFTA. So part of the we would be referring to the trade union that I'm employed by. The other part of the we, as I expect, would probably refer to the position tabled by Labour at NEDLAC. There's really, and you would know this well, there's two chambers in NEDLAC. Well, there's a chamber in NEDLAC that deals with trade and industry matters called the Trade and Industry Chamber. And there's essentially two levels where trade matters are engaged on. The higher level and the lower level. At both there are representatives from the different trade union federations, COSATU, FUDUSA, and NACTU. And in the engagements that I'm involved in one of the lower chambers that deals specifically with trade agreements, there are representatives from there. I guess, Jeff, by extension, your question is, to what extent does the we include trade unions not in NEDLAC? And I guess the answer is self-evident. I mean, I wouldn't be able to speak on behalf of unions and workers that are not at NEDLAC and not represented there. But I must say that there is an attempt to keep an eye and advocate for sort of common interests. But I mean, if you can allow me not to get into the politics of that and just avoid the politics of that, I'd appreciate that. The second one on the continent, but if you can also clap me for it. I don't mind if you want to clap me on that issue. At the continental we level, there's at least two versions of that. We have had engagements within the clothing, textile, footwear, and leather unions. Let me say, not nearly sufficient. We've done some briefing notes that we've circulated through our global trade union federation Industrial, through the African chapter to African unions. Doing briefing notes as recently as last week. I was in touch with the Nigerian union, briefing them on issues that were emerging on clothing and textile matters. We don't always have as much success engaging with some of the other unions. There are some unions which just don't tend to respond, some which do, but Industrial is from its side running engagements with many unions on many of the issues on the continent around the rules of origin issues, etc. At the same time, the federation that I belong to, COSATU, is engaged at the AU level with other trade unions on the continent. But that's not something that I do personally. I can only really speak to the things that I do personally. So those are, I hope, give a little bit of insight into some of the questions from Jeff. I saw a question on the chat. I think it's from Calvin, and it's really questioning. I think it's questioning the use of something like protectionism, and I think it's a good question. I don't think we must hide from the fact that you know, that protectionism can have the effect of making a country and its products, quote unquote, uncompetitive. I mean, it's the nature of the awful beast of global trade, which is brutal to workers, that you know, products and industries can become, quote unquote, uncompetitive through protectionism. But I think there's a better way of thinking about protectionism, which is not narrow protectionism. It's the kind of thing which Hamida flagged earlier, which is really, you know, the kind of balance between encouraging trade and protectionism, and maybe rooted in the concept of industrial policy. And you know, so if I was to say to you, if I was to rephrase your question and ask, is industrial policy useful? I'd say absolutely, definitely. And industrial policy can be enormously beneficial, but then the ability to tweak the input of products through imports must be enabled. But at the same time, one must deal with other factors of production to try to be, quote unquote, more competitive. And that's just the kind of nasty reality of it. But industrial policy, I think, can give the opportunities to be more competitive, and it would have to use the tool of protectionism in that process. So yeah, Comrade Hamida, I hope that provides some guidance to Comrade Jeff and also to Calvin. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Simon. I see there's a couple of more questions, so please do feel free in the chat or to engage some of the comrades or participants who are asking the questions, if you're not able to do so on the one-on-one, so in a one-on-one basis as opposed to on the platform. But thanks very much for your comprehensive response. Comrade Jonathan, over to you. I don't know if there's any specific question you'd like to speak to or any comments that you'd like to make.
Yeah, absolutely. I was also going to pick up on the issue of protectionism. I think Simon covered it quite well, but I think there's a tendency when we hear the word protectionism to think of sort of the crude, reactive rhetoric of, say, Donald Trump or Brexit. And I want to make fairly clear that that's not what I'm referring to. And I'm speaking about putting some tariff barriers around specific infant industries and things like that. And I won't speak for the other speakers, but I think that's not what they're referring to either. We're talking about sort of a rejection of free trade, but also a rejection of the crude reactionary protectionism of recent years as well. And there's sort of a middle ground that needs to be found there, where there is some room for protecting industries from sort of the vagaries of the global market that, as Simon says, are brutal to workers, but also just sort of putting massive trade barriers and tariffs around entire countries, not coupling this with industrial policy, is also incredibly harmful. So I think just pure protectionism, as we tend to think of it in sort of a popular sense, is also very harmful and must also be rejected. But Simon put it well in saying that trade policy should be driven by industrial policy. It should be a part of industrial policy. And looked at through the lens of industrial policy, there certainly is room for some level of protection, especially of key strategic vital industries. I also wanted to pick up on the point about the impact on the tax base. And I think that's very important, that a lot of states do get a lot of their government revenue from import tariffs, especially a lot of African countries are quite reliant on this. And we see across the continent today a sort of increasing austerity measures. And if the states also lose their import tariff revenues, the austerity measures are likely to only increase, which will make everything worse. It will mean even less money that can go into industrial policy or any other sort of development programs, welfare programs, etc. But I think that's also an important point. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. So I know we've got like 5 minutes to go, and I just want to, may I abuse my oh, I see there's actually a hand. So maybe let me go to Andrew, before I then abuse my power as the chair. Please go ahead, Comrade Andrew. Hi, Comrade Andrew, could you unmute and then take the floor? Hi, okay, while we, oh, there we go. Thanks very much. Please go ahead.
I didn't have an unmute button. Thanks very much, Comrade Amanda and all the speakers. Just a quick question, and maybe if there's some time for them, for the speakers to respond, then it can be also a suggestion. So I'm just thinking, within Africa, there's also quite a long tradition of thinking and practice related to the rural and peasantry and so on, and also worker-peasant connections. So I'm just thinking, do the speakers, or maybe it's a suggestion for future engagements, have any thoughts around also what the AfCFTA means for rural areas, given that the majority of Africans are actually still living in rural areas, and also what that means for potentially also the need to also, rethink or think about how we think about industrialization, the impacts on biodiversity, ecologies, climate change, and so on. I'm just saying it from where I work, where we monitor a lot of, especially corporate influence in African agriculture, which is often linked to the discourse and the of industrialization as a justification for measures that very often benefit a very small rural elite at the expense of the many and at the expense of ecologies and so on. So there's also these deep linkages between industrialization and rural areas as well. So yeah, just wondering about if the speakers have any thoughts on how we think also about the free trade area and rural areas and rural inhabitants.
Cool. Thanks very much, Andrew. Let me take Comrade Lisa, and then maybe I'll make some comments and maybe also offer the opportunity to the other comrades to respond. Or even if there's attendees or participants who'd like to respond to any of the questions or comments, please answer as well. Comrade Lisa? Hi, Jonathan, but perhaps you can facilitate and unmute. Thanks very much.
Hi, did you say Letu?
Yes, I did, Com. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So I tapped in the question on the chat, but I'll just repeat it. I was asking to Simon, I said, please excuse me if this is a naive question, but how influential or how strong is COSATU in terms of influencing or lobbying the South African government in matters of such, in terms of policy creation on such issues, both domestically and continentally?
Okay, thanks very much.
In other words, does he think that COSATU can, whether it's via NADLEC or other structures, can influence the government to its own benefit to whatever extent?
Cool. Let me hand over to Comrade Simon.
Cool. Letu, I think it's a great question. Can I go to Andrew's question quickly and come to yours afterwards?
Yeah, no, not a problem.
So on Andrew's, I think Andrew's is a fantastic question, because the whole concept of the AfCFTA is based on essentially a consumerist model, commodity exchange, and it's ultimately linked to the development narrative, which is, we trade goods, we build roads, we build houses, what. It's not nice to rural areas. It doesn't have a sensitivity to the fact that if you survive off agricultural subsistence farming or agricultural, or your desire is not to be part of the commodity or the cash economy, it's not kind to you. So I don't see the AfCFTA as a liberatory tool in terms of rural economies. What it may do is, it may generate jobs in areas. There may be remittances sent to areas. There may even be some sort of quote unquote, I suppose, development or industrialization in rural areas. But that's not to say that any of those things are necessarily good or better than what currently exists. So I think it's a great question. And obviously that's the problem with the development paradigm much more broadly. In terms of Letu's question, that's also fantastic. Look, if you're speaking about the AfCFTA in particular, the challenge with it is that it's sedimented. The various annexures have been written. So now we have an enormous task of trying to reshape something I think we are asking ourselves whether we're saying to ourselves we must do it, and we're not entertaining the fact that we may not win. The reality in a situation where the rules have already been established is that you may not win. But I think we are trying to say to ourselves that we've got to take these things. We can't stop advocating for them, and we continuously advocate. So even in the last meeting I had at NEDLAC a couple of weeks ago, we've put the social clause back on the table. And we're expecting to have a conversation at the beginning of next year. We won't win it in that conversation, but we've got to push to be able to amend as far as possible the rules of the AfCFTA, or develop the kind of offset mechanisms in our own domestic industrial policy that will allow us to cope. When it comes more broadly to other policy issues, I think there's a mixed bag. I think COSATU is very successful in some areas and less successful in other areas. And I think it really depends on the extent to which you're dealing with hard ideologues in the state, philosopher kings in the state with their little empires, who are determined to believe their own ideologies and build their own empires. That's the one challenge we face. And obviously, our ideology is not the attractive one. But at the same time, I think, comrades in the movement have to be deeply self-reflexive. And I think very often unions don't manage to do enough to push the policies that they want. So I think it's a mixed bag. Part of it is the genuine obstacle of power and of ideology. And some of it, I think the unions must sort of point a finger at themselves and say, can we do more? We can do more. And they've got a bunch of ideas about what can be done. But I hope that helps, Letu.
Thanks, Comrade Simon. And I hope the comrades were quite happy with the responses that were given. I know as the chair, so I'd like to, before we close, and I think Comrade Jonathan, I'm going to make a couple of comments that might be setting the cats among the pigeons, and maybe it's a way of actually facilitating a process that in next year you'll coordinate us again in order to have a second discussion, but hopefully a slightly longer. And I think we'd probably, from each of our different constituencies, perhaps bring in a lot more comrades, because I think both from civil society organizations as well as from labor, I think the issue around the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement in the context of South Africa hasn't been had in the way that it's have happened in Southern Africa as well as on the continent in relation to the Africa continent, the ITUC, for example, amongst the trade unions and the different regional trade union blocks. So I'm not so sure that protectionism is as bad as you make it out to be. I think when you come from a context where liberalization has devastated markets, you don't have to be nationalistic in the racist way or xenophobic way that Donald Trump articulated protectionism. But I think and I think particularly Andrew's comment in relation to the rural communities, if agriculture or informal economy markets are the key thing to provide livelihoods to people and women in particular. And I think we haven't had the opportunity to interrogate the issue of the gender dimension of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, or liberalization for that matter. But I would think that on certain levels, protectionism, particularly for the developing South, is an absolute demand. It's something we should be doing, and we need to actually get to a point where we're not going to level the playing field, but we definitely have to be in a much stronger position to be able to negotiate. I think on the question of the tax base, there was a question in relation to whether the tax base actually does facilitate whether liberalization or the AfCFTA is going to erode it. I think most definitely, if you look at just the issues that Simon was raising in relation to how the textile, clothing, footwear, and leather industries, and you can go to the food industry, you can go to manufacturing. Just take the steel industry as another example. When you erode jobs and the tax base in terms of people being employed, because governments are actually not taxing the people that earn the highest, relatively, so that they can actually be subsidizing and bringing the income into our country. That's one challenge. The second is illicit financial flows. So if the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, for example, is going to facilitate through the process of financialization, the exodus of more and more money and revenue that's generated, as opposed to building our economies and actually creating a Pan-Africanist opportunity for us to develop as a continent, I think we're going to find ourselves we're going to find ourselves with our back against the wall. So again, like I said, this is an area I'm particularly passionate about when it comes to trade. I don't get the platform very often. But I'm not going to hold you because I know that the meeting is supposed to end at 12:30, and we've already extended it 5 minutes beyond your time. But please, if I could make a request to the AIDC, I think this is an absolutely important space. And Jonathan, going forward, I think it would be really good with maybe more advanced notice. We can actually have probably either SADC, but also an African perspective, with a lot more engagement and definitely a lot more time for attendees to be able to engage. But with that, I hope everybody has found the discussions engaging. Thank you to the panelists. We've unfortunately lost Comrade Africa, not lost in the sense that he's passed, but lost in the sense that he's had time constraints. But yeah, I think all three panelists really wonderful and really insightful contributions, and I'm hoping it will stimulate thinking, and perhaps we have convinced the AIDC through Jonathan to definitely coordinate us and have another meeting for next year. With that, thank you very much to the kind comments in the chat. For all those comrades, please do feel free to engage either Jonathan in terms of emails for the different presenters. And if we don't see you, stay safe, look after yourselves, noting the new COVID wave, be blessed, and hopefully we'll engage again next year. Thank you very much, and thanks to AIDC for hosting the event and for allowing me the opportunity to host the event on their behalf as the chair. Thank you very much.